Let's talk about something a bit uncomfortable. There are thousands of people worldwide with learning difficulties who are choosing to live their lives the way the rest of us do. Go on dates, have relationships and intimate experiences, and go on to become parents and have families. Let me begin by defining what I mean by learning difficulties. So, I'm talking about people who have been diagnosed with or identified as having an intellectual disability, a cognitive impairment, a developmental disability or delay, or a traumatic brain injury. It sometimes comes as a surprise to people, even in their own families, when a person with learning difficulties, or LD for short, expresses the desire to become a parent or actually goes on to have a family. Let's start with the legislative and public policy perspective. The United Nations initiated the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2006, in which it states very clearly the right of all persons with disabilities to marry and found a family, to decide freely and responsibly on the number and spacing of their children, and the right to retain their fertility. Most countries have signed on to adopt the convention, including Canada, which ratified the convention in 2010. The law is clear and the numbers are increasing. More and more people with LD are becoming parents. What is the reality? First, there is little to no reproductive education and subsequently awareness of reproductive rights amongst women with LD, or generally people with LD. Often women with LD experience significant violation of reproductive rights through non-consensual sterilization and contraception. Looking farther along in the lifespan, those people who do go on to become parents, they're often overrepresented in the child welfare system. A recent Ontario study of almost 4,000 women with LD showed that 5.7% of their newborns are discharged straight to Child Protective Services from the hospital. For mothers without LD, this number is less than 1%. This is an alarming statistic. Over 50% of children of parents with LD are placed out of home at some point in their life. Additionally, a recent analysis showed that parents with LD were featured in over 10% of all child maltreatment investigations. Their cases were also kept open for longer in the child welfare agencies that they were involved with fewer chances of resolution. And parental IQ and intellectual disability alone has too often been the primary reason for termination of parental rights. So there are some truths that must be noted. Yes, they do have difficulties. Along with having an intellectual disability come problems with working memory, executive function. There may be possibly a risk of adverse behavioral outcomes in children. But the truth is that parents without disabilities can also have some similar difficulties. Research has shown that there is no difference in developmental outcomes of infants who have moms with and without LD. What is often perceived as a static, unchanging trait related to disability is in reality simply a skill that needs to be targeted for improvement. Because there is a presumption of limited capacity, there's often no appropriate parenting support offered, which actually might be offered to parents without disabilities. Research has shown time and time again that parents with LD do quite well with specialized supports and a strong social support network. In fact, social support has been revealed to be one of the strongest protective factors in keeping a family together. There has been a lot of research on skills training for parents with LD in a variety of forms. They benefit from it and their kids benefit from it. Let's talk a bit about the children. It is important to acknowledge that, of course, there is legislation governing children's rights. In Ontario, we have the Child and Family Services Act, and globally, we have the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Child welfare and well-being is at the forefront of child protective services all around the world. But this is sometimes taken out of context by child welfare agencies, especially when a parent has a disability. The lack of child well-being is assumed as a direct result of having a disability, which often leads to systematic discrimination. Although the research on children of parents with LD is limited, there have been studies that have shown that making every effort to keep the family together is usually better in the long term. There has been qualitative work with done with children of parents with LD and they've expressed strong attachments with their parents and the desire to stay together as a family. Children who end up in the foster system due to parental disability often have poor outcomes compared to children who stayed with their parents. Children, when interviewed later in their adult life, did express difficulties growing up, such as parents' inability to help with homework after a certain age, children having to help their parents more at home with tasks such as cooking, cleaning, keeping appointments. However, we have to think, do these difficulties necessitate child protective action, or do they just highlight the need for better supports so that these families can thrive? Let's look to the future and see how we can make this situation better. We have to acknowledge that the number of parents with LD will keep increasing. They are more aware of their rights and are more proactive in seeking support. But there is a lot of work to be done. As a nation, we must invest more in parenting research to help families of parents with LD be successful. We must also have an awareness of not only child rights, but also parent rights, and adopt appropriate child welfare practices to achieve the best family outcomes rather than just individual outcomes. This includes doing proper parenting capacity assessments rather than using parental IQ as a reason to terminate a parent's rights or remove a child from a loving home. Another way to move forward is to have a national strategy for parents with LD, similar to the Healthy Start program in Australia, which has made great strides since it began. All of the research that I have discussed in this presentation is listed here. Also, a disclaimer that the audio-visual materials to create this presentation are open source. Thank you for listening.